Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. I am Joel A. Erickson. I'm joined as always by Nate Atkins. We are in the interlude. We are back in Indy for a day between the Cincinnati joint practice and the Cincinnati preseason game. Um, Nate, our practice observations in the joint practice got more pushback than normal.
Yeah. More attention than normal too.
For a couple of different reasons. We're going to try to we don't try not to do this too often, but we're going to try to take you through our process a little bit, and just help you guys understand what we're seeing. Although, at least in my case, and Nate can get into his, but like in my case, the difference of opinion with me is just if you just read the observations post I did, I tell you what happened on all 20 plays I'm just describing. So I don't really know where the confusion lies, but we'll start with Nate's. Nate, you had the offense yesterday. You had a unique vantage point that we don't often get, and it led to some stuff. So I'll let you kind of let people know.
Yeah, so this was a first practice for us, training camp practice this year that was not at Westfield. So every day at Westfield we cover practice basically the same way. Outside of the two joint practices against the Cardinals. So what Joel and I always do is we split it up. One person watches the Colts offense, one watches the Colts defense. But it's the same sort of places we watch, the same sort of way you watch practice. It was different here in Cincinnati. They practice like right next to their stadium, and every training camp setup's a little different. The one we had is like there's just more places to walk. We ended up kind of posting up right on the sidelines, right by where kind of the Colts were running their offense. And I guess you get to see more, you get to hear more. And the way that practice was going, which was not super well for the Colts, was every play was staying around the line of scrimmage. So kind of right by where we were at. And so we just got to hear more from the players than we normally ever get to hear. And the Bengals players decided to be quite vocal yesterday. This happens a little bit. Joint practices tend to be chippier than when teams practice against each other. The team that's kind of at home, I noticed this in Philadelphia last year, there tends to be a little bit of a feel of like, this is our place. You don't walk in here and show us up. So the Bengals players are feeling it a little bit. We're talking more than the Colts players. Also, as the way the practice played out, they had more to talk about because just a really bad day for the Colts offense. It was, I called it what I thought was the worst practice. And maybe there's been a worse one for the offense. It didn't go well for them. But more than that, it was more about kind of what the Bengals players had to say about it. And so those quotes kind of led the observation story. And just the way this goes sometimes is a lot of training camp days, there's not anything newsworthy. There's not a lot buzzy. It's a practice. It's whatever. But once in a while, a story takes off. And this one seems to have really blown up because of some of these quotes. I don't know if you guys didn't happen to see it. Some of the quotes from the Bengals players, they were basically talking to the Colts players at this point. And so you had, and to give you some context, Anthony Richardson started 3 of 10. There was a lot of problems with the offense. They couldn't run block. They gave up sacks early on. Receivers didn't seem to be ready for the ball. Kind of everybody was letting each other down. I don't quite know why it was so off, but it was off for all up until a 2-minute drive that the Colts finally kind of put something together. But during this stretch where the Colts basically couldn't get any yard, couldn't block, couldn't do much, it got to the point where Anthony Richardson was just kind of holding the ball, scrambling, waiting for someone to get open, not seeing anybody open, not sure what to do, scrambling out of bounds. That happened on a lot of plays, and it happened to run right over by where we're at. So we heard these players who were saying things like, BJ Hill yelled, he went right at Anthony Richardson, the defense tackle of the Bengals, and said, "Throw the ball, bro." That was a big complaint that they had, was that Anthony was not throwing the ball. That's what Cambritt Taylor turned to us, a cornerback of the Bengals, and he asked us and the fans behind us, is that all he does is run? And then you had at one point kind of the weirdest play I saw. I still have no idea what was going on, but Anthony rolled out and he didn't have pressure, threw the ball, and I had no idea where it was going. It kind of landed between 3 different players. Must have been some kind of miscommunication, which happens sometimes. But Bengals safety Geno Stone yelled out, "He's just throwing to spots. He doesn't see his receivers." And the thing about this is, like, players, trash talk is part of football. We don't often get to hear word for word like that. When we do, I try to incorporate that sometimes, but it's usually you present it as like, defense was feeling itself. What was interesting about this version of it, though, is it was almost more like these Bengals players were complaining that the Colts weren't better. Like, they wanted to get more work in than they were. They especially their secondary seemed to want to get work. They didn't seem to like that Anthony was holding the ball just to run out of bounds. They didn't feel like that was productive to them. So, when I shared these quotes, I think a lot of people thought it was kind of like embellishing trash talk and making something out of what is just sort of light trash talk. But it was more like, it was notable to me just that these players were kind of bothered by, they were taken aback by how bad the Colts were and not really pumping their chests out about how good they were. And they were like, the Bengals defensive line's really good. They messed them up, but it wasn't so much the Bengals making plays. It was just a weird day for the Colts offense. And so, it's notable though that I use that because it's good color. It's always interesting when you hear players talking, but also some of this is the most real stuff you get. We get players at podiums afterward. This training camp setup, it's different than in the regular season. I use a lot of player quotes because we get to go to their locker. You get to build relationships with players. You get more one-on-one interviews. You get to kind of build out a conversation and get them in a more authentic space. When guys are at podiums more, so we talk about pulling back the curtain, but I want to show people the difference here is that, those usually not the most authentic interviews out there. When a player's at a podium, there's a lot of cameras, there's PR guys looking at them. That's where you tend to get a little bit more cliche player speak. And I don't tend to use that as much if that's what it smells like to me. The more emotional you get these people, the more in the moment you get them, especially when you get them dialogue between teammates, which is what a couple of these were. The Geno Stone comment when he said he's just throwing spots, he didn't see his receivers. He was saying that to his other secondary members. And it wasn't like, haha, we got him. It was like, this is what's happening. And so, we use it because it's real and authentic. And I think, the whole reason that we go to these practices and we travel to Cincinnati and drive 2 hours and back is we're going to places fans can't go. And so when we get right there on the sideline, that's a good place to kind of show you the sights and the sounds, and it's good and bad. And so if the Bengals, and I was going to use kind of whatever they had said. So, if the Colts had been ripping them up, or if Anthony was dodging these guys and making them fall down and all this stuff, and there were like Bengals players were reacting in awe of that, or they were frustrated themselves, I would have absolutely thrown that in there. If Colts players were answering back to them, trash talking them, I would have used that. Now, they didn't have anything to trash talk about yesterday. So it's just, this is what happened. This is not, it's not cherry picking. It's also just fit exactly how the practice went. I mean, I know some people, like, we were joking yesterday. I must have terrible luck with this because I had the Colts defense for 2 practices last week against Arizona. Now, one of them was fine. Colts defense played better, but that was the weird one with rain, and it was. But the one I got to watch a lot, I was the only one over there. They got shredded, and so I jokingly was like, "Well, I'll watch the offense this week." We assume that's the better unit. They had ripped apart the Cardinals by the sounds of it last week, and then this was their dud. So it just feels like I'm kind of getting stuck with some of these worst performances. And I'd rather watch good football, but whatever happens, we're going to share with you the good and the bad. And I think people got to understand, especially with Anthony Richardson, there's going to be elements of both. And that's especially true in his first training camp, coming back from shoulder surgery, from missing, 8-10 months or so of football action, from playing only 4 games, from playing only 17 games above the high school level. There's some great moments. There's some plays. It didn't happen yesterday, but there's plays he makes, throws he makes on the run, the way he moves. Like we talked about, he had a play in the red zone last week against the Cardinals that dropped back. They covered everybody. He just took off, and it felt like he took 2 steps to get in the end zone before anyone could move. And you saw that freakish athleticism that made him the most athletic prospect at quarterback that the NFL has ever seen coming into the combine. There's also going to be the other side of it of like, this kid is still learning parts of this offense. He's still learning timing with his receivers. He's learning that balance between scrambling, holding the ball versus when to throw it versus when to scramble. And the Bengals brought out those mistakes, and they kind of were pointing them out and relishing in them, or kind of annoyed by them at times. This was their first look at Anthony Richardson. Again, they didn't play him last year. They played Gardner Minshew in that game. So they kind of heard about Anthony, never saw him, and then they see him, and their impression in that moment from one practice was he's holding the ball and he's just trying to run, and he's not completing passes, and he's not throwing to where his receivers are. And that is what happened. I mean, it was so including those quotes was just a way of showing you what happened in one practice. But where this gets carried away is like, I mean, it's the internet gets carried away sometimes, but it's like it's one day of practice too. So like when I say things like, I mean, I think some people, I called it last week when I was talking about the Cardinal or the Colts secondary. I said they got annihilated that day. I think yesterday I said this was the worst Colts offensive performance. I'm sure you take those in for what they are on face value, and it seems like hyperbole and relishing the negative. Like I said, I don't know why I get stuck with these bad performances, but Joel, has there been another day? You track this a lot more than I do. Has Anthony started 3 of 10 in any other practice or something?
No, I think that's the most inaccurate he's been. I think he had one where he started like 2 of 7 or 3 of 8. I just looked it up. I had him at 61.1% over the course of camp. So 3 of 10 is an outlier.
He finished it. And also, some of these things are in the moment. When I tweeted that, he was 3 of 10. Then they did have a nice drive at the end of that practice where they finally got together for a 2-minute drill. They didn't get in the end zone, so it wasn't like everything got settled, but they were moving it. And Anthony finished. We had him at 10 of 20, which is obviously better than 3 of 10. It's not what you want it to be, though. It's down from at 62% or what. It's down to 50%. So it wasn't a great day, but also it's one day of practice. So I don't know that like it's not really saying anything. Like I think it's running wild because I think I know it's a lot of fans from other teams that are kind of looking at this. I know some fantasy football people picked it up, and it's coming off as if like this guy doesn't know how to see the field. He doesn't know what he's doing out there. That was how Bengals players reacted to like at that time 10 plays that the Colts ran. And it was a little unfair that they put that all on the quarterback when, Bernard Ryman, Braden Smith, Brian Kelly, they were just getting blown by in pass pro. I have not seen that all camp. That was kind of the most surprising thing to me. It was a really good offensive line, just was not really doing anything. And like I said, the Colts receivers weren't helping them out. A.D. Mitchell did not come back to a ball on the sideline that I thought Anthony threw pretty well. It's almost like he didn't maybe know it was going to come his way. There was a lot going on. There was a practice where Shane Steichen, he always is with the offense, but this day he decided with the joints setup, he wanted to watch the defense for the first half. So I don't know if that's what threw it off, that he wasn't there, if that played into it. I don't know. It could be a lot of different things. It's probably just a bad day, though. Like this, it's going to happen. I mean, you think about this team last year. Now the pieces were a little different because Anthony wasn't out there, but they had bad games last year too. Like they had a game in Cincinnati against the same team where I remember us getting the post-game podcast and we couldn't come up with 2 heroes of the game. It was that bad. And yet this team went 9-8 though. Like they had some great games too where they destroyed the Steelers and got to run every play of the fourth quarter and beat the Ravens on the road and beat Lamar Jackson. So it's a little bit of the nature of the NFL where games are inconsistent and certainly days of practice are going to be inconsistent. So I guess what I'm just getting at is it's sort of like I just saw some people really taken aback that I specifically took that angle to quote Bengals players and play that angle. But again, like that's what a practice observations story is. I don't know that there's another way to observe that practice without telling you about what happened in the practice. And I know one thing that is fair is it does come off like it was very one-sided. It quoted, we quote a lot of Bengals players. We didn't get to talk to Colts players about this, really. Shane Klein talking about the offense because he wasn't over there. And I would have loved to ask Anthony Richardson or Michael Pittman Jr. or Alec Pierce or Colin Granson or A.D. Mitchell about this. None of them were available. So that's kind of the nature of the setup in camp, especially the joint days are very condensed. Something I'd like to see the Colts fix in the future because I think it would be nice to talk through this. I'd love to hear Anthony's perspective on, did he feel like he should have thrown earlier? Was nobody open, or like kind of all that? He's really open and good at talking about that. We just didn't get that opportunity. So, but we're always going to give you kind of the sights and sounds of it. And the last thing I guess I'd say on this is that I think Colts fans are frustrated with this a little bit because the quotes are not nice and the day was not good. But I'm telling you, like, these quotes would have taken off too if Anthony was ripping them up and Bengals players were yelling at each other, or they were like, holy crap, this kid's amazing. Those quotes would have been in the story. Based on the vantage point we had, we would have heard that stuff too. And so that's just kind of our role, is like, we're not here to, play Santa Claus. We're here to kind of give you what's real, the good and the bad. And with Anthony, there's going to be good and bad. And if you're one of those that just kind of wants the rose-colored view, if you want to just hear about how Anthony is this giant who's ballooned up to 260 pounds and he was drafted by a blue chip GM and his coach is, the next Don Shula, I don't think the IndyStar is the place for you. I think probably the broadcast of the third preseason game when Jim Irsay is on the broadcast, I think that's probably more the place where you'll find that kind of commentary.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a unique thing. The hardest part is that, like, in terms of reporting something that the players are saying in the field, is it's very hard to be sure of what they said most of the time. If you've been out of training camp for Colts, you guys, at least the ones in the front row or the people walking behind us, you're not that far forward from where we are, and it's really hard to hear stuff other than like coaches yelling "stay up" or the Colts assistant who screams out "2nd and 3," who's got an incredible voice and should not hide that at any point. He can really yell, but it's hard to hear it clearly. Like, for example, my spot for where I was watching the defense yesterday was in a corner of the field. I couldn't walk the sideline. Like, you were right there on the sideline. I couldn't do that. I had to be either in the corner of one end zone or the corner of the other end zone. And you just can't hear anything. You can't hear the same amount of stuff. So, like, I didn't have the option to put that kind of stuff in there because I couldn't hear it. Usually, if you're reporting on something that a player is saying or an argument players are having or something, you usually just have to, like, describe their body posture because you can't hear what they're saying. Like, I did it with Raekwon Davis yesterday because he was back for the first time, and there was like some disagreement between the offensive line and the defensive line during one-on-one pass rush. And he was like right in the middle of it talking, but I don't know what he said. Not with any accuracy. That's the other thing. You have to know for sure that that's what they said and who said it. And that's typically very hard. You had a unique spot where you were right there on the sideline. And it kind of get something you don't normally get.
And there were also, like, the way this goes too is pretty much every Colts reporter except one of us from the IndyStar is watching the offense.
Yes, I was the only person who watched the defense. It was just me and a bunch of Bengals reporters.
And last week, I was the only one watching the Colts defense. And so that's some of it too. Like, I've seen that reaction out there too, is like, why are you playing up so much about the Colts offense being terrible if the defense had a great day? And it does sound like the defense, as you can elaborate on, had a very nice day. Most Colts reporters are not going to watch the defense right now. It's just the way that it goes. It worked in reverse last week, is that not as many outlets were writing about the struggles of the Colts defense because they weren't watching it. You can only watch one at a time. And so you may get some updates on it. You may get to, I got to watch like the very end of the Colts defense yesterday. I saw Kwity Paye win on a great inside move and just blow up the play for a sack, and everybody kind of was hooping and hollering, and you could tell the defense was enjoying a better day. But that's the thing though, is like you said, you gotta be sure of what you're seeing and hearing, and it's why been taught about this a little bit. It's why we don't tweet as much during practice, as we're trying to watch and make sure you get it right. It's hard with the setup. You can't check as much with players and coaches, but in that moment on the sideline, we're all sitting there, all pretty much every reporter except for Joel on the Colts beat. So we all heard it. We all asked, is this what this player said? And one of them, the player was saying it to us. So it was almost like their version of an interview. So that was, that made it a little easier to quote him. But yeah, it just doesn't often happen that way. But it's one of these things, like it's you get these dilemmas or interesting points with this job in this social media era, where like certain quotes, you just know once you hear it, certain dialogue, that it's going to take off. It's going to become a big thing on the internet for one day in this nature. I remember thinking about this when, I had the moment after the Browns game last year, and Michael Pittman Jr. made comment about how maybe he's not a part of the offense in an interview I had with him. And I remember thinking about, like, what this is going to do, and how the player's going to have to answer for this maybe, but if we don't share it, I don't know why else we're there. Like, we get begged for more updates in training camp. I've been seeing that a lot. So it's like, when we go and we see and hear things, we're going to share it with you. And then you just hope that people are, willing and able to put it in the right context. And that's like all I would stress with this is like the Colts had a terrible offensive day, and it was one day. And yes, to those Bengals defenders in that span of 10 pass attempts, Anthony did not look good. He didn't look like an experienced passer, but that was those players don't get to watch him the rest of the time, and that's not how he's practiced, and that's not what we saw in games last year, which they didn't even scout because they were facing Gardner last year. So just everything kind of deserves a little bit of context. I think it's just kind of hard this time of year. That's why I'd really stress reading our observation posts rather than just just looking for tweets and stuff, because we're trying to put all of it in there, all the good and the bad. And some practices have good and bad. Yesterday happened to just have a lot of bad for that offense until that 2-minute drive. They did kind of make up for it there. And so, but yeah, it's just important to remember, though, that like one day in training camp is not always the story. Now, there are some things we see all the time, and that's why past podcasts we've talked a lot about the secondary, because those struggles have shown up a lot. Now, it sounds like they didn't show up yesterday. I know Jamar Chase wasn't practicing. I didn't get to watch that group, but like the secondary, when certain things show up all the time, we're going to bring them up. Like, Josh Downs, when he was practicing every day, he was showing up and looking awesome. So if it was one day and then he never did anything the rest of the days of camp, it's important to take that in context. And it's hard. Things just get lost because something becomes a one-day story, and people aren't necessarily remembering or adding everything up. Not everything gets the same weight. A lot of attention right now is on this one horrible practice for the Colts offense. It doesn't get the same attention all the days where they just look pretty good, but it's not necessarily newsworthy or different. And it isn't against another team that's chirping. And that's the thing too, is you get the attention of Bengals fans and writers. I know there were a lot of Bears people jumping in on that because the Bears, their offense kind of tore up the Bengals defense in the rain. And so, they're leaning into this as like, look, maybe the Bengals defense is good. It's just everyone's hungry for football right now. Everyone's hungry for real football, and I am too. And that's why, like, my big thing I love to stress this time of year is like, I subscribe to Brian Billick's logic, which is that you can't tell who can play in the preseason. You can only tell who can't play. I think it's a bit of an oversimplification. Like, if something happens Latu can play because he does it every day. He's going to be a player. We'll see just how much, but like for the most part, like a thing that happens here or there, especially in, when they're not game planning, when it's not a real game setting, when you may be going up against, guys you won't go up against in real games. It's very different too than stacking it up for 17 games, because there's going to be guys who can have one good game out of nowhere, one bad game out of nowhere. So I would just let's just pump the brakes on like taking anything that's said or written right now about one practice and seeing it as something more than that one day. Sometimes it's just fun to realize, like, hey, let's just live in today, and like let's worry about tomorrow. And here we are. We're on to a new day, and the Bengals and Colts play a preseason game, and hopefully, maybe by the time you listen to this, all that's washed away, and the Colts have moved on and look a lot better on offense. But I'm not, just to wrap it up, like I'm not changing that much of what I think about the offense based on yesterday. I would only tell people that, like, it's not realistic to think Anthony Richardson's just going to dominate every game he goes out and plays when he's barely played. Like, he's going to have he didn't have his full rookie year, which I think was going to have some rookie moments in addition to those explosive moments that we got to see, like in the Rams game. I think he was going to probably have some moments where there were mistakes too once things play out. It's a hard league. And again, when he gets to the regular season, teams are going to be game planning specifically for him. And that's the thing you brought up all the time, is that we haven't seen the Colts run their scheme yet. So he hasn't been put in the best situations to show his talents either. So it's just kind of remember, everything right now is just practice and one day at a time.
Yeah, I would say, like, in terms of Richardson specifically, there's definitely some inconsistency in his throwing, like, especially even within the practice sometimes. Now, early on, it was often like 1-on-1, 7-on-7 that he would struggle, and then as soon as there was a pass rush, he would seem to lock in. He also seems to do better when they're running up tempo, which is interesting. But there's definitely some inconsistency in his game. I was telling somebody this the other day, though, and I think it's a good thing to discuss here. The hard part with Richardson during training camp is that I actually don't think, and I think a lot of the fan base has picked up on this based on some of the sort of late blooming interest in the team so far, is that a lot of the questions we have about Anthony Richardson, we can't really answer until we get to the regular season. Like, can he stay healthy? I mean, he could get injured in training camp, but that's more likely a question for once he's in the regular season and he's running and everything like that. The questions about how consistent he's going to be as a passer, you can kind of, I think, get some of that in training camp, but it's still not the same as, like, for instance, with Gardner Minshew last year, what he did in training camp was running more of the full offense. And then once they got into the season, they really focused on RPOs and the stuff that he did best, which is the same thing they're going to do right now. They're compiling data on what Richardson does best, and then they're going to game plan it once they get in the regular season. And so, like, the fact that he's inconsistent as a thrower, that's not that surprising. We kind of knew that. The question of whether or not that inconsistency is a deal breaker as a starting quarterback in the NFL, it can't be answered in training camp. We're covering it and we're charting it and we're doing all that stuff to see. But there's so much about Richardson's game that we saw just enough of him last year to have a feel for who he is. And anything that happens in training camp can't really answer it. So we're kind of in a spot here. We're recording this 16 days away from the opener, where, and I think a lot of the fan base does understand this, like, we're not going to get real answers until the real games start.
I think sometimes there's just a lot of false reads out there. It's not only that one day can get more attention, it's often one play. Like, this is such a highlight era right now. And especially what's weird is, like, we're only allowed to film the individual portions of training camp. And so those are, when there's good plays, those are the ones that are going out there on the internet. That's like, if Anthony has if he has a gorgeous throw on the run, this happened with A.D. Mitchell some, because, one-on-ones, you tend to see that athleticism play out more than what they're going to actually be in a football setting. And with Anthony, I'd actually say some of the clips that have come out have been not good throws, because he's not at his best in one-on-ones, but we're not able to show the plays in team settings where he does well. Or sometimes the team will put stuff out, but of course the team is going to, promote the best plays and not the full look. So it's such a highlight era. And I often will hear people when we give a certain observation, they'll come back and say, well, I saw a clip that said this. And it was like, no 6-second clip is going to answer for something, not in its entirety. And I get it's hard. It's not like you guys can go to every training camp practice and watch the full thing. We're there doing that. And so that's why I'd encourage you guys. I hope you guys are reading the IndyStar, because we do a lot of coverage with the two of us there, trying to hit this up. And if you read it consistently, I think you'll kind of get the feel for where it's at. But even within that, like you just said, there's still a certain level of measured approach need to it, which is like my rate on Anthony this training camp, I think you'd have to come out being reasonably encouraged, but not blown away, which is also the thing that was likely to happen. And again, the best thing that's happened is he hasn't had health scares, and he's been able to stack these days with his receivers. He's getting this work in. So even he's going to benefit some from when it doesn't go well in a practice like this, because they're going to go and they're going to watch the film. They're watching the film today, or yesterday they were watching the film, and in all these meetings, they're going to go over all this stuff and figure out, why were you holding the ball, and where were you trying to throw on this play where it looked like no one was around, and why didn't Drew Ogletree and A.D. Mitchell turn their heads around faster? It's like all the stuff that they get to work through right now before the games count. And struggles, that's what's like interesting about being a young quarterback, is the struggles, you learn a lot from that too. And he just didn't get to play enough last year to kind of stack that all together. But I think to the point about like the inconsistency, I mean, we saw that last year. Inconsistency as a passer, I think his rushing upside is very consistent. The question there is going to be how much do they want to tap into it and risk it? How it's the volume level. But like, I don't think there's a question of like, is he going to play well as a runner on a consistent basis? Because he is consistently explosive, and he looks natural there. But like as a passer last year, his overall numbers in 4 games, 84 attempts, he completed 59% of his passes, 6.9 yards per attempt. For a rookie, okay, right? Decent, not great, didn't knock your socks off. But what we saw were moments, flashes. The last 2 games specifically, so he missed that game against the Ravens with the brain injury, came back. Last 2 games, this is where you see the inconsistency, but the flashes, only 54% completion, but 8 yards an attempt, 2 touchdowns, no turnovers. Yeah, that was great. And then the Rams game specifically was when that kind of bottled it all. 11 of 25. That's not what you would call efficient, but 8 yards an attempt and just some crazy great highlights when he had Aaron Donald in his lap and was launching the ball at Alec Pierce down the right sideline, and that throw to Mo Alley Cox was just incredible. Again, under pressure and kind of the perfect moment to throw that. So that's just he is going to be an inconsistent passer, at least in the short term. And who knows, maybe 17 games is a long time. And the hope, I think, the goal, the best case scenario, I think, realistically for Anthony is he hits that stride at the end of the year. Where think of like how rapid the growth can be. If he's only started 4 games in the NFL, he's only started 17 games total since Eastside High School. So if he makes every start this year, he will double that. And that's going to be all NFL games. And it's just such a learning moment where like every week is this sort of like push and pull where like he may have a great week, and then defenses are going to look at like, how do we have to adjust? We're going to play them a little differently. We're going to take this away that they're doing really well. And the great thing with Anthony is he's got these sort of different skills, and Shane Steichen, you trust him to like kind of tap into that and game plan. And that's all the stuff we're not seeing now. But like there's going to be, certain matchups that are harder for him than others. And it's just going to be this growth curve. It's like, I think people just want quarterback to be like this linear growth thing where it's like, okay, he came in inaccurate, then he got more accurate. So he's just going to like keep getting more accurate, and you never take a step back. But growth is just not linear like that. You see quarterbacks sometimes that have great rookie years that take a step back. Sometimes quarterbacks ping pong. I mean, look at Baker Mayfield's career, where somehow he's had an amazing rookie year, terrible year, comeback type of year, terrible year, great year. They got him a contract with a new team. There's a lot that plays in it when there's instability like that. But even guys who have stability, very rarely are they Patrick Mahomes show up awesome the first day and just they are what they are, or they're going to get better. They never take a step back. Like guys often take, steps forward and back or all over the place. Like Josh Allen's first couple of years were moments of great plays and horrible plays. So with Anthony, what you're hoping for is the marriage with Shane Steichen is going to limit the moments when he's asked to do things he's not as good at, which is that sort of consistent, just step back pocket accuracy. Shane's not going to ask him to be CJ Stroud. It's a different skill set, but he's also going to accentuate the things that he's great at that we're not seeing in camp, like design runs, like scrambling within the pocket and actually taking off down the field. And some of their other plays with play action, explosive type attempts that they haven't put out there entirely yet. So I think overall, my read on Anthony is that he's in the place that was most realistic. It's maybe not the place everybody wants right now. You want it to be like this Lamar Jackson year 2 ascension that's going to like launch him into the MVP conversation. But every player is in a different space. And like Lamar, just to put that conversation out there, like, yeah, he had a very up and down rookie year. He still got to start 7 games and a playoff game. And he didn't miss time for the same kind of injury. And he played a lot in college. So everyone's just at a different sort of point in where they're in their trajectory. But I think for Anthony, it's the explosiveness is there. The health is there. And we got to get real games to see just how consistent the passing can be and how much he's going to grow and how fast he can hit that ceiling.
From my perspective, the thing that came up with me was just like I said that the Colts defense didn't allow the Bengals to score. I know there were some Bengals highlights. Like one of them was from 7-on-7. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, I don't count that because there's no pass rush. So that's never a part of mine. That's also the difference. That's also, I think, the difference in numbers.
Wait. You don't think the Colts defense is the same if you take the pass rush out? Why?
I don't think any defense is. But if you saw, like, I think somebody said something about like 24 of 28 or something like that. I don't chart the 7-on-7 at all. I just don't. With the exception of like sometimes I would do it with Anthony just because he's a younger quarterback, but it's not real football. The other piece of it is like there was one play that they maybe could have scored. It was against Dallas Flowers. Jermaine Burton caught a ball on like the 2 or 3-ish, and it's not supposed to be a tackling practice. It's not supposed to be a tackle of the ground practice, so. Flowers kind of wrapped him up at the 1.5, and Burton kept going and got in the end zone. But the referee that was there he marked him down. So I just kind of went off the referee rather than trying to guess whether or not it would have happened. Other than that, I think the biggest difference is just, I think if you were looking from a Bengals reporter's perspective, if you're looking at completion percentage, Joe Burrow completed a ton of passes. They were just very short. And out of 10 plays in the red zone, when generally in most practice periods in the red zone, there's like a handful of touchdown passes or a handful of touchdowns in one way or the other. That's kind of been the case through all of Colts training camp. Bengals didn't get in at all unless you count the Burton play, which again, like I said, that was the referee. I was going off what the referee said. The 2-minute drill, everybody saw that. Bengals offense looked terrible in the 2-minute drill. And then there was one other period, and there wasn't a big play in that either. So I think one of the things that I just kept stuck out to me was this is a lot of completions, but for not a lot of yards. I think that's going to happen when you have different people evaluating practices differently. But I would say that I went into it kind of expecting Joe Burrow to put up some explosive chunk plays on this Colts secondary, and not like after the 2 red zone periods, I was standing next to a Bengals reporter, and I was like, they really haven't moved the ball, have they? And he was like, no, not really. And so that kind of, I would say what I ended up thinking and writing about that practice was different than what I thought. Like I said, it just depends on how you're evaluating it. Are you evaluating on completion percentage? Are you evaluating on points? That kind of thing. For me, the thing that stuck out was in 20-ish plays, they never got in the end zone or scored points. because their 2-minute drill, well, every other 2-minute drill at least ended in a field goal attempt, including the 2s for the Colts and the 2s for the Bengals. The Cincinnati's first team offense went 4 and out with 2 sacks. And not like maybe we're not sure of sacks, like actual sacks that the coaches ruled this is a sack. So anyway, that's the difference for me. I think the sack thing is also kind of a fun thing to talk about because it is hard to know if someone would get a sack in a real game or not. For me, if the defender runs past the quarterback behind them, that's a sack. If he abandons his rush so he doesn't hit him and runs past him. Sometimes I will say this, sometimes the coaching staff will give you an indication with where they place the ball in the next one, or so the offensive coaches typically stand behind the quarterback. So when you're watching a pocket, you can usually see the coach behind. And for me, if a defensive lineman runs past them and the coach kind of gives up on the play, if that makes sense, if they kind of stop watching it, it's a sack. Even if the quarterback then throws it. I've come around to the point where I started recording those throws after the sacks because they still threw the ball. I didn't used to do that. But yeah, so that's the difference there. I don't think it's that big a deal. In the grand scheme of things, it's just one practice. But just for you guys who are, we've had some questions. I've had some questions. I do most of the observations for us. And I've had some questions about some of this stuff over the course of training camp. There was one last week where a friend of the podcast and fellow Colts writer James Boyd said that he thought that the Cardinals won the one-on-ones versus the Colts receivers, and I said the opposite. Well, I think him and I talked about it, and it just came down to he was evaluating did they catch it or did they not catch it. I was evaluating it on did the receiver beat the defensive back off the line, because the receiver can't control what the quarterback does. So anyway, sometimes it just comes down to a difference of opinion. All of this stuff is just we're writing what we see. We're giving you what we see. Some of this stuff will go opposite of the way it seemed in once the regular season starts. It happens every year.
Yeah.
But usually it happens to the team too. Like a good example is Nick Cross was the starting strong safety to open the season 2 years ago and got benched a game and a half into it. So what they thought coming out of training camp wasn't actually how it went. So that's some behind the. It's a long, lengthy sort of behind the curtain look at how observations are done.
Well, just to build on that point you talk about, it depends on what you focus on. That's I felt that was so true during the Colts Cardinals practice. So I had a tweet that went bananas when I said that basically my takeaway from the first day of their practice with the Cardinals, the defense was the Colts defensive line was dominating, and the secondary is getting annihilated. I don't know, maybe annihilated is a strong word. It's a fun word. It felt apt to me to describe plays where I couldn't figure out who the DB was because he wasn't in the picture. But at the same time, I think dominating is a pretty strong word too. But it just depends on what you look at, because there was a Cardinals reporter I talked to who his takeaway was he was just shocked at how much the Colts pass rush beat the hell out of the Cardinals offensive line. And they did. And, but we're used to that. We're kind of expecting that in that matchup. It's more like we're trying to see does the thing that looks leaky get improved, which is the secondary. And in that practice, the answer was no. But in a real game setting, I don't know how that's all going to play out, because since they couldn't hit Kyler Murray, we didn't have the chance to see, some of these explosive plays for the defensive side. But we're probably going to be forced fumbles. Kyler Murray may have been knocked out of that game with how badly he was going to get hit on some of those plays. But we also did see, he has the ability to get away. And if he gets away and throws it, and that's the thing that's kind of hard with the mobile quarterbacks, is figuring out, would a sack have been a sack? There was a play yesterday that the refs in the 2-minute drill whistled Anthony down as basically a run at the line of scrimmage because he cut inside and right by a corner, and they said the corner would have tackled him. And I'm thinking, yeah, good luck to a nickel corner tackling that guy as he's got a full speed ahead a one-on-one tackle. Like I give Anthony that kind of credit. There's other plays that like yesterday were so blown dead that Anthony was thrown away just to avoid an accidental hit. So those are kind of more obvious sacks. So the point is, it is all hard to get a firm read on. What we do is we just try and cover all these. There's been 13 practices and just trying to see like, what did we see kind of consistently come up? What felt more like an outlier? And it's more like, what are the kind of the vibe levels? It's like, we're encouraged by the pass rush, but how much? We're encouraged by Anthony's pocket movement, but we need to see him get hit. Like there's just we need real football, man. Like that's kind of my big takeaway here is I just think like we drive ourselves crazy over analyzing football that ultimately is not real. And it taps into the obsession that this country has with this sport, but also this is kind of deranged. Like we're nitpicking all this stuff because I mean that's our job to do it to a point. But man, I'm ready for some real football.
In other words, Nate wants me to change Colts camp observations next year to Colts vibe check. It's about the vibes.
Yeah, it's vibes. That's all. It's just about vibes.
I'm not good at picking up on vibes, so we're gonna have to rely on you for that. That's what we'll do. I'll do a camp observations next year, and you can do a vibe check.
All right.
The one other piece of news I think we can discuss before we get out of this podcast, because we probably talked too much about how we do our jobs by now, is Jelani Woods suffered a toe injury. He's going to undergo surgery. One thing to talk about, first of all, I know turf toe doesn't sound bad, but turf toe can be really, really bad.
Mm-hmm.
When Philip Rivers was dealing with it when he was here, I remember somebody explained to me that it can basically end up being like a dislocated toe. It can like separate your feet. You can't get them together. It can mess with ligaments and tissues and stuff like that. Turf toe is sort of an easier way to say it, but yeah, it can be anything from like a sprain to like a dislocation of a joint, which that's bad. Mm-hmm. Ligament tears are often repaired with surgery. So just getting that out of the way. And credit to Jake Query. I was on radio with him before we started this, and he was pointing this out too. And kind of gave me the idea to do it on the podcast. Like turf toe, it sounds like turf toe sounds like athlete's foot. That's what it sounds like. It sounds like something that Tough Acton Acton would fix. It just does. They should name it something else. They should name it a dislocated toe, or a strained ligament or something. But it's much worse than that. And I think one of the tells that like kind of helped me figure it out was when Rivers had it. Quentin Nelson was like, "No, his foot looks awful." He's like, "I don't know how he's playing through it." So anyway, that's a quick thing for Woods' time as a Colt. The implications are pretty big. Just for one, we had wondered if he was going to end up on the cut list. Because it seems like, well, and based on the last preseason game when they rested starters, Mo Alley-Cox and Kylan Granson have already made this team. And that leaves Drew Ogletree, Will Mallory, and Woods for all intents and purposes. Keeping 5 tight ends didn't seem like it was going to happen. Not to me. Probably not to you either. And with Ogletree's blocking ability, although I think Woods has gotten better at that, it felt like that was maybe a spot that they were going to have to make a tough decision on Woods. They don't anymore. Yeah, my assumption would be, based on what Shane Steichen said and based on my own reporting about him going through surgery, that he's going to go on IR, and that does allow them to wait. Just does. He could return this season. In all likelihood, the tight ends will probably not get through the season healthy, all 4 of them. And so that gives them an option to bring back whenever he's healthy. And it maybe gives Woods another chance to prove that he can do something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just a really unfortunate blow for Jelani Woods. You know, it's not that he was having this big time breakout that it interrupted, but it interrupted the chance to kind of get into this team and get into a mode where Shane Steichen can, once you make this team, especially as a pass catcher, Shane Steichen's going to figure out what you do best and give you some moments to show that, to be that. And for Jelani Woods, that still was a player with the most upside in this tight end room, certainly as a receiver. And I think as a two-way player, there's, you talk about his improved blocking. I thought that was starting to show that if he could find some kind of role in the passing game, and even if I thought the thing that he struggled with most in this camp is sort of, just sort of the football movements as a receiver, the route running, the finding the football, the connecting, the consistently catching. But if they had simplified it down to some RPO and screen passes, I think he could have showed that explosiveness. And he's the only one that has receiving ability who can block, and the only one who has blocking abilities who can catch, from what I've seen on this group right now. And so as you look at this in the NFL, again, this is so far off, but the reason that we had this conversation about potential with guys is that, like, what their hope for was when they drafted him was that they could eventually tap into one of these two-way tight ends who has a lot of talent in both those areas and can blend the run with the pass to have answers against any personnel match. And you see a lot of the teams that go really far in the NFL playoffs have those tight ends that are kind of on the field, whether they're running or throwing. And some of the guys are really good at doing both. Think, Travis Kelce is obviously a superstar receiver who's adequate enough as a blocker, but like George Kittle, monster in both areas. The Niners are always a force. Dallas Goedert is very good in both areas. The Eagles went to the Super Bowl. David Njoku is great in both areas. And the Browns made the playoffs last year, and he had a Pro Bowl year. That's what they were hoping for when they drafted him. And hope is different than the reality of what you get. But to me, the disappointing thing with Jelani Woods is I don't know. I feel like we got a little bit robbed of seeing what the growth could have been like, especially going back to last year was the real robbery. Because I think coming off his rookie year, you had to be pretty encouraged for a guy that was making the transition from quarterback to tight end after a transfer to the NFL, where that's such a hard transition. The blocking was bad. It was frankly bad at the start in much of that year. But the receiving, you saw some of the explosiveness. He had 16 first downs of his 25 catches, averaged 12.5 yards a catch, and had a game winner against the Chiefs. That, for relative to how much rookies struggle at tight end, that was a nice window into that explosiveness. And so then, like, you look at the blocking this year where he added strength and kind of reworked his upper half, the lower half to balance out his body and worked on technique. So you saw some of the, like, if you just could have put that all together and not had that year lost to the hamstring injuries, you could have just mixed that. If you could combine that explosiveness from his rookie year as a receiver to some of the refinement he's shown as a blocker this year and give that to Shane Steichen at this position, man, that would have been fun. It may not have hit the absolute ceiling, but it would have been something that I think would have been the Colts' top tight end if that had all played out. So I think the place they're left in now is wondering, can Jelani Woods, after 2 straight years of a significant lower body injury, can he get this together? Can he have a shot at it? I hope he does, because I know how much he's worked at it, but it's a serious question right now. And the reality that they're left with is just a tight end room that is all kind of one-trick ponies that Steichen's going to have to mix and match with. And the good thing is that the receivers and the offensive line look good enough to where I don't think it's not like 2022 where those guys needed to really step up in both areas and couldn't, and it hurt them so badly. This year, they are just like supplementary pieces. And so I assume they're going to keep those other 4 guys, and 2 of them are blockers, and 2 of them are split out receivers with kind of limited select route trees. And we'll see how they can kind of combine together. But it's just, to me, it puts more importance on the explosiveness of the Colts run game, and these Colts receivers that have looked so good. Those have to be the stars because they don't have a star at tight end. That's just the reality we're at with how this has played out with Jelani Woods.
Yeah, the toughest thing I think is that you get to a point in a career where, like, too much lost time really can rob you of the opportunity. And we're kind of getting to that point with Jelani Woods. Like, you hate to say that, but it's true.
Comparison I think you can make here a little bit is Paris Campbell.
Yeah, at some point, all the missed time adds up, and it changes what you can do. Now, I do think this probably helps the Colts because it means you can hold on to these tight ends longer and give them more time to make a full decision. Gives them a little bit more time to make a full decision. But, if he misses, like I said, every expectation is that he's out for a while. And if we're talking about him missing a season and a half or something of time, where he's been in the NFL for 3 years, but he's been injured more than he's played. That really does start to affect things. Going forward, like, yes, they could keep him on the roster. The thing is, they can still keep him on the roster next year if nothing happens. If he ends up on it, because he's going into the last year of his rookie deal. It's not. The cost isn't prohibitive. Kylan Granson and Mo Alley Cox are both free agents, I believe. And you can keep him on the roster. It doesn't like hamper your flexibility if you feel like you have a different player, So it's just one of those things that, it's a really tough break for him. It's a really tough break for him. I did not feel like he was having a great camp. He wasn't like there was a handful of chances for him to make the kind of play that he was drafted to make, and I didn't feel like he made many of them. But it's still better to be healthy than not to be healthy, because it's another mark against him.
Yeah, my thing about it was like, I know I've been more bullish on. I thought Jelani was going to make it. Now we'll never know. It's irrelevant. My main thing is that while he wasn't seizing the moment, I've flat out not been impressed with any of these tight ends. I will say Will Mallory actually was probably their best offensive player yesterday. Again, not many competitors to that yesterday, but I did think he had a nice practice. But for the most part, I just have not seen any of their tight ends rise up in a very impressive way. So I thought that there was at least a lane to where we were going to have to see this get in the regular season and see if can anybody develop within that in a way that has not come true in the preseason. And then who knows, that may still happen. Again, Will Mallory's still young. Drew Ogletree's still young. But I think, like I said, I'm back to kind of the point of where these are role players. These are supplementary pieces. And the thing you think about when you talk about Jelani Woods in the long term, kind of what this position is going to look like, Kylan Granson and Mo Alley Cox are both in contract years. And, there was talk, we know that the Colts tried to trade up in the draft in the first round. I think most assumptions is that's for one of the wide receivers, either Rome Odunze or Malik Neighbors. There's some people who thought it was for Brock Bowers. We'll never probably know for sure, but they don't regret getting Latu. He looks amazing. But it is one of those things that you just kind of think about the what ifs sometimes. And what if they had Brock Bowers on this team? That'd be just a ridiculous collection of skill talent. Look, they have Latu. He looks great. But I think more about going forward, that's going to be a position we talk about a lot heading into next offseason, is that they're going to have two guys who are free agents. We'll see the years that they turn in contract years for Kylan Granson and Mo Alley Cox. But so far, they have not shown – guys that look like they're ascending to new levels, that there is this high-end upside. And I think ultimately that's what they will want to get out of a tight end. That's the whole reason they drafted Jelani Woods. And that's kind of what a lot of these – you look around the league at like these offensive gurus, they all tend to find one of those or try to find one eventually. One of those tight ends who can kind of be their guy. And they're mismatched chess piece kind of guy. And I think Shane Steichen's eventually going to want that too. For now, he's got a hodgepodge group, but I think going into like next year, especially in the draft, that's going to be a big time conversation for this group, because the offense doesn't need a lot on paper. We got to see how guys develop and stuff, but they've been drafting a lot of these other positions. They've been stockpiling them, or they've been locking guys up to long-term deals. They're going to ride out with Anthony Richardson, but tight end is one that I think is going to be a big, big conversation going forward.
We'll get a lot more information tomorrow. I think one of the things that no one likes to think about, the Woods thing also highlights this. This is why I got this. While we're doing all our roster projections, injuries can change our roster projections significantly, and either crystallize or muddy the waters on stuff pretty easily. So that's one of the things to watch, honestly. Like, I think everyone's going to be watching how the offense performs, especially and defense, especially since the Bengals are not playing anybody. So it'll be Colts starters versus Bengals backups. And in the case of the defense, that means they'll be playing against the number 3 because Jake Browning is hurt. So everyone's going to be focused on that. I think for the purposes of the roster, like when someone gets hurt, the severity, all that stuff is really important because it has ramifications for what the decisions they make next Tuesday. But for the IndyStar, I'm Joel A. Erickson. This has been Nate Atkins. That's wrapping up training camp. We'll probably be back next week after the roster to kind of discuss the decisions they make.